Hello again. It's time to begin Lecture 18 in the Israel and Prophecy Part 1 series. At this juncture, we're now entering the last of the 7 units. So we'll begin today Unit 7, the 2,520 years of Leviticus 16. You need to take a look at your workbook. There are going to be about 16 questions that will be in connection with this, and we'll get moving and plunge on in. And as we go through the material, you can keep up with that and hopefully get your answers as you need to record them there. There was a saying in the 19th century that really was pretty much expressed throughout Europe and in many respects around the world. It was, "God is an Englishman." Now, that seems like a pretty lofty statement. It wasn't so much, however, a claim made by the English. It was the conclusion that people outside of the British Isles came to based on watching what was going on in the rather remarkable circumstances of England in the 19th century world. It must have appeared in many ways to contemporaries that no less than God himself was divinely prospering English politicians, statesmen, diplomats, explorers, generals, soldiers, admirals, architects, engineers, scientists, inventors, bankers, businessmen, shopkeepers, entrepreneurs. The whole length and breadth of English society seemed to be carried along in this train of success. Why did that happen in the 19th century? Unit 7 is going to focus primarily on the issue of timing. As the 1700s came to a close and the 1800s began, the Anglo-American people, with an emphasis on the Anglo side, because the English were the pace setters. They were there moving and shaking first before the Americans moved on to eventually catch up with, and in the latter half of the 20th century, actually even overtake them. Why did this ascension to unprecedented heights take place at the time that it did? The facts of history, and we've talked about the distinction between facts and interpretation, the facts of history are undeniable. Historians speak in terms of the 19th being the British century, the 20th being the American century. What we want to look at here in this final unit is, why did this happen when it did? We want to look at what historians can show us, which is how it took place, how it happened. But without a biblical perspective on this particular issue, the why and the when are really left to random chance. They're all but impossible, really, to explain. And yet, when you look at the issue, it's rather like, I was speaking this past weekend to a congregation in one of the Texas Churches of God. And to demonstrate the point, I talked about my own personal problem in terms of vision. I have a very bad stigmatism, and I cannot see very far beyond as I've gotten a little bit older, even in terms of reading. Now, I almost, the vision is so bad, even that far away, I have to have something to correct the vision to see, the glasses or contact lenses. Now, when I put that lens on my eye, a contact lens, suddenly the picture clears. I may be able to see shapes and forms and contours and outlines, but in terms of sharply focused definition, I can't see it. You see, the Bible is very much like that in terms of understanding some elements of how and why history has, or why and when, I should say, historical events have unfolded in the way that they have. Now, the story of the ascension of Joseph's children, of his descendants, the rise to a kind of unconditional prosperity is an interesting tale. And as I believe I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the name Joseph itself derives from a Hebrew word which means "let him add," implying prosperity, implying growth, implying an increase, which indeed is really what begins to happen as you enter the 18th century, and especially as you get past the midpoint in the 1700s and move rapidly toward the close of that period. It's almost as though, if you read, there's one passage in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 22 where it talks about blessings literally overtaking Israel. And in many respects, when you read the story of the British people and their rather remarkable rise to success, that's quite the case. In many of the developments and trends, the way in which they unfolded. Their success seems preordained. It seems inevitable. There was even a historian, a Cambridge professor of modern history. His name was J.R. Seeley. And Seeley, in his studies of British imperial expansion, summarized quite nicely the nature of Britain's success, at least in the imperial sphere. He said that England had acquired her empire in, quote, a fit of absence of mind. And indeed, when we get to part 2, one of the things that we'll see as we look very carefully at some of the history of these events is that success seemed to overtake England whether or not she even did the right thing. It's a commonplace saying among the British to speak in terms of, well, we'll muddle through. We'll get through this and see it through to its end, and eventually we'll be successful. And what you really have in the story of Britain's remarkable 18th and 19th century rise to prominence and world domination is a story of a people that really literally seemed to be unable to do anything wrong. Even the things that they did that might have in a technical sense been wrong oftentimes turned to their own advantage, and it worked out in the long run to their great benefit. A big part of answering or explaining the why of this goes back to Genesis, the 22nd chapter. And a little later in the lecture today, we'll look specifically at some of those verses. But God made the Abrahamic promise in both its spiritual and physical dimensions unconditional. Once Abraham passed a certain threshold, which is described in Genesis 22, we find that those conditions attached to the promise, as it's described in Genesis 12 or 13 or 15 or 17, those conditions are released. And it becomes just a matter then of how God will fulfill the promise and when He will fulfill the promise from that point forward. When greatness began to overtake the British people, they even themselves oftentimes looked in a certain measure of slack-jawed amazement and deduced that there's something more here than meets the eye. It seems as though the hand of providence is prospering and blessing us. I want to read a quote from a man whose name was Lord Rosebery. Rosebery was a very active individual in British political life. He was not a British Israelite, and so far as I've ever read about him, he had no awareness or understanding of the ideas that were out and about in his time and day in the late 19th century. Rosebery was British Foreign Secretary from 1886, or in 1886, and then again in 1892 and 1894, and he actually even became Prime Minister for the British people in 1894, spilling over to 1895. A few years after that, in November, in the year 1900, he spoke to a group of Glasgow University students about the British Empire, and his words are worth repeating here. Rosebery said, "How marvelous it all is, built not by saints and angels, but the work of men's hands, cemented with men's honest blood, and with a world of tears, welded by the best brains of centuries past, not without the taint and reproach incidental to all human work, but constructed on the whole with pure and splendid purpose. Human and yet not wholly human, for the most heedless and the most cynical must see the finger of the divine. Growing as trees while others slept, fed by the faults of others as well as the character of our fathers, reaching with the ripple of a restless tide over tracts and islands and continents until our little Britain woke up to find herself the foster mother of nations and the source of united empires. Do we not hail in this less the energy and fortune of a race than the supreme direction of the Almighty? Rosebery spoke more than probably what he realized. And as the British people of the 19th century reflected on and surveyed the landscape of what had happened in their remarkable, unique century, many people among the community, at least, of British Israelites came to the conclusion that what they must be living in the midst of was the fulfillment of a remarkable, a grand, a dramatic prophecy that you find in the book of Daniel chapter 2. You may recall the Babylonian emperor Nebuchadnezzar had a dramatic and a very troubling dream. Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon from 605 to 562. In his dream, he saw a magnificent and a fearsome image. It was an image with a head made of gold, with arms and a chest of silver, with belly and thighs of brass, with legs of iron, and with feet made out of iron and a mixture of miry clay. Daniel was eventually summoned, and Daniel had the insight, the revelation from God to interpret the meaning of this remarkable image that Nebuchadnezzar had seen. He informed the king that the head of gold was representative or symbolic of the Babylonian Empire, an empire which lasted from around 605, the rise of Nebuchadnezzar, to 539, when ultimately it was displaced by the Persians. The Persians themselves founded a fairly long-lived empire, almost 2 centuries, from 539 to 331 BC. And that was symbolized or represented by the silver component of the image, the arms, the chest. Then the brass section, the belly and the thighs, representative of the empire founded by Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, an empire that extended on down, or kingdoms which sprang out of the empire after Alexander's untimely and premature death. That lasted until around the 100s BC, at which time Rome began to swallow up the Greek provinces. And by the year 31 BC, of course, Rome had established its famed and heralded empire, and that extended over nearly half a millennium, collapsing, most historians would agree, around 476 AD. Now, those legs of iron symbolizing Rome rested on top of feet that were made out of clay, a strong mixture because of iron components mixed within the clay itself. But the image was top-heavy. Each of the metals in descending order of the sequence, the specific gravity of each is heavier. So the image, in a sense, is unstable. And that, frankly, is highly symbolic as well in terms of world-ruling governments. Human rule, from the time that Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, from that time until this, human government, even in its best forms, has been flawed. It's had problems and difficulties, as Winston Churchill and others have said. Any form has within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Ultimately, it tends to collapse over the long haul, when imploding upon its own weight. And in this image, or in this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, the image is struck by a stone which comes, as it were, from out of nowhere. It's a stone cut without hands, implying divine origin. It strikes the feet of the image, crushing them and allowing the image to collapse on its own weight, and the episode is concluded in the destruction, symbolically speaking, of the kingdoms of this world. The quotation itself, let's just read from the biblical account. You'll find this in the book of Daniel. In verse 34, we read that the stone smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and it broke them to pieces. And then was the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broken into pieces together, and it became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, and there was no place found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. What we see here is a prophecy about the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, setting up the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. But you know, there were those in the 19th century in the British Isles who perceived what was going on around them and legitimately, as I'll show in a moment, asked the question, are we that stone? Now, they made a monumental mistake in interpretation. No human rulership, no human empire, no human government, even at its best, including the Davidic Solomonic complex, nothing will approximate what we await in the future in terms of the establishment of the rule of God on earth and the happiness, the peace, the prosperity that will envelop the world. Jesus Christ will be the architect of that. Nonetheless, some mistook the empire for the real thing. In fact, it was a forerunner. It produced some good and positive results. And in retrospect, I think we can be somewhat sympathetic of those who made those deductions when we realize, when we look, as I'll show you now, at the positive results that were produced. The British Empire had a certain global reach, if you will. Like the kingdom of God, it was an empire on which the sun never set. 25% of the Earth's population was under British rule in one form or another. 20% of the Earth's land masses, that being the most choicest portions, were under British control. A part of British presence inevitably meant that there would be the extension of law and order. A classic example of that would be the abolition of cannibalism in various places within the empire. Africa would be one in particular. Or in India, the British elimination of the practice of thuggery, which was a very brutal, quasi-religious kind of rite where in the traveling season, in those months in India when groups would go from one place to the other, various thugs, as they were called, would intersperse themselves with groups of travelers, and then in the night awaken, and almost in the style of a serial killer or murderer, they would slay their victims in a ritual form, bury the body parts, and so on. The recension or the turning back of the practice of the sati in India, which was a method of dealing with the social problem of what do you do with a widow after the man, her husband, has died. And in India, that problem, until the British stopped that practice, was resolved by the British interceding and stepping in and preventing that widow from being thrown onto the funeral fire or pyre and burned alive with her deceased husband or spouse. So there were good things in terms of what the British did in extending law and order, regular rule of law. The stimulation of economic development, the introduction of technological advances, which, like some Promethean fire, the British held the key to those secrets. And as they established themselves in Africa and India and other places far-flung around the world, Britain brought with them infrastructure, transportation and communication networks, the building of rail lines that tied together different regions and literally made what we know today the nation of India, as well as other places. The erection of various buildings and structures, the setting up of communication lines and the like. The establishment of peace would be another dimension to this. In fact, the 19th century is oftentimes known in a euphemistic sense as Pax Britannica, the British peace. The abolition of the slave trade, led by many people, but one noteworthy figure in particular, William Wilberforce, born around the mid-18th century, He lived till 1833, but he was a crusader for abolishing slavery. And in the early 1800s, Wilberforce and those who worked and helped him to accomplish that end finally gained success. The missionary movement would be another example, where in the 19th century, high hopes among British Christians that they would be able to take advantage of English dominance throughout the world and use that as a vehicle to spread and disperse far and wide the Christian message in hopes of converting the world to the Christian religion. Now, all of those things, as I've mentioned in this lecture already and in earlier lectures as well, they were forerunners. They were types. They were a shadow of the reality which ultimately will come. Let me go back and rehearse each of those points, and we'll look at a scripture or two, and in the process we will see what a far contrast, or what a large contrast the reality will be from the forerunner, or the type. If Britain controlled 20% of the earth's landmass, Christ's kingdom will be worldwide. It will be without fortified borders separating regions. Psalm chapter 47. Psalm 47. Clap your hands, all you people. Shout unto God with a voice of triumph. For the eternal Most High is terrible, and He is a great King over all the earth. Once again, the notion of the Anglo-American peoples being Israelitish does not place them ahead of other peoples. They are the vehicle that God will use to eventually establish control of the entire world. This messianic and millennial psalm very clearly amplifies those concepts. He shall subdue, verse 3, the people under His feet and the nations under our feet. Verse 5, God has gone up with a shout, the eternal with the sound of a trumpet, an allusion to 1 Thessalonians 4:16, and also again in 1 Corinthians 15, the last trump, the return of Christ. Sing praises to God, sing praises unto our King, for He is the God of all the earth. Sing praises with understanding. Verse 8, God reigns over the heathen, and He sits upon the throne of His holiness. So we see that the scope and extent of this stone cut without hands and the kingdom that will be established by Christ upon His return, ultimately and eventually, it will be global, far exceeding anything that Solomon or the British or anyone else has ever done in the record of human history. If the British extended rule of law, it was British law and not the law of God. And there's a palpable and tremendous difference between the two. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 3. Many people shall go and say, Come, let us go up into the mountain of the eternal, the house of the God of Jacob, and He will teach us His ways, and we will walk in His paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the eternal from Jerusalem. Again in chapter 11, another millennial passage with rich, full prophecies, some of which we've looked at in times past, but I reiterate here again to draw the contrast between man's best efforts and what Christ will bring. Verse 2, the Spirit of the Eternal shall rest upon Him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding and counsel and might and knowledge, also in fear of the Lord. Verse 3, and shall make him of quick understanding in the fear of the Eternal, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither reprove after the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness, with the godly principles and laws, shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he'll slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be his girdle, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins. In regard to economic development and technological advance, yes, the British were prosperous, and they brought infrastructure around the world where they built railroads and bridges and communication networks. But British prosperity British industrialization and technical advance came with all the attendant social evils, it was not equitable in the same sense. It was not stable, pure, and enduring in the sense that God's economic system will indeed be. Isaiah 65. If you'll turn there, we'll look at a prophecy pointing to chapter 20, verse 22. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree are the days of my people, and mine elect shall long enjoy the work of their hands. And in our urban industrial world of the West, oftentimes that is not the case. In fact, oftentimes workers feel alienated in the workplace, cut off from what it is they are producing. They shall not, verse 23, labor in vain, nor bring forth for trouble. For they are the seed of the blessed of the eternal, and their offspring with them. Amos 9 speaks to the abundance, again a passage that we've looked at in previous lectures. But the kind of economic prosperity that will come will be unlike anything we've seen for a sustained period in the history of the world. Behold, verse 13 of Amos 9, the day will come, says the Eternal, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, that the harvest will be produced that fast and that abundant quantity. The plowman will overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that sows the seed. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. Micah chapter 4. Micah 4 and verse 4 again. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. Everyone will enjoy the labor and the fruit of their work. It will be a time unlike anything that we've ever seen, with the economic laws, which are probably only fully and completely discerned by God Himself, implemented, introduced, and in operation to sustain the kind of economic growth that man has pursued without ever really fully grasping throughout human history. Continuing on to use this as a bridge to the next concept, and none shall make them afraid. Pax Britannica was world peace in many respects, but it was based on something quite different than godly peace. It was based on superior military power and might, technical superiority, control of strategic passageways, whether land or sea, around the world. It was not rooted in the process of writing the very laws which produce happiness. When we obey the laws of God, the happiness comes in due course. When those laws are written on the hearts of men and women, then the peace of God will prevail without having to have peace enforced. Verse 26 of Ezekiel chapter 36, a new heart also will I give you, a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away that stony heart out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments, and you shall do them. Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah 9 and verse 6. Heralding a time when the Prince of Peace will come. The child to us, unto us a child is born, and a son is given. The government, when Christ returns, He'll establish a government, shall be upon His shoulders, and His name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And of the increase of His government and peace there shall be no end. Matthew chapter 11. For those of us in the church today who brought our lives under the umbrella of God's laws, principles, judgments, and statutes, we enjoy a foretaste of what it will be like. Yes, we live in an imperfect world, and not everything is the way that it should be. In some respects, we play on a playing field that is not quite level because we obey God and observe His laws. But nonetheless, God prospers and blesses His people for that obedience and for embracing that lifestyle which will produce the millennial peace that will come under Christ. Matthew chapter 11, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. From the time that Adam and Eve made their wrong decision in the Garden of Eden, from that point forward in human history, man had to work by the sweat of his brow. He had to battle the forces of nature, to coax a living. It involved labor. Likewise the woman, if you read the account in Genesis chapter 3, the woman would bear children in heavy labor or travail. A metaphor, if you will, for the way in which the world would work up until the time that Christ would come at His first coming and the establishment of the church. Those who have responded to the call have received this rest. At Christ's second coming, when He will make His presence known to all humanity, and that government which He'll institute and establish will girdle the globe, rest will come to the earth in worldwide proportions. Take my yoke upon you, verse 29, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For relatively speaking, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The missionary movement. Indeed, there were some remarkable things done. A man named Carey took Christianity to India and made some interesting and quite significant strides in many ways. He and his co-workers translated the Bible into multiple languages, many of the dialects that were read and spoken by the people on the Indian subcontinent. But yet the world is not Christian. Only a percentage of people practice the Christian religion or a version of it. If you'll turn to Jeremiah chapter 31, that forerunner of the ultimate realization which Christ will bring. In very colorful language, in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 34, we read, and there shall there shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know you the Lord, because they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, says the Eternal. And I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more. Forecasting and heralding a time when, if you'll turn over to Isaiah chapter 11 and look at verse 9, hailing back to the concept of world peace, they shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, and the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Eternal, just like the waters cover the sea. Remarkable predictions, remarkable prophecies. The empire, in essence, provides us a pattern, a shadow of things yet to come. Unfortunately, it was run by men. The inevitable tendency in humanity is toward ambition, toward self-interest. We're limited, even our best of human intentions are limited and don't measure up. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 20. Even the best of human rulers, our administrators, our parents, are limited in what they can accomplish and achieve by our humanness and the weaknesses and frailties and flaws that keep us from doing the things that we sometimes know we should do. The principle here in terms of leadership, Christ was approached by James and John's mother. The appeal was made that they might rule on his right and left hand in the kingdom, and Christ used that as an opportunity to deliver a lesson in terms of what government should be all about. He called unto the disciples, and he said unto them, You know how the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over those people over whom they rule, and that they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. Whosoever will be great among you, let that person be the one that serves. Let him be the minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. And Christ set the example, even as the Son of Man came not to be served or ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. That kind of government awaits the return of Jesus Christ. Even as good as some human government can be and has been, we're not there yet, nor will we be until ultimately Jesus Christ returns and sets things in order based on his government principles, statutes, judgments, and perfect administration of them all. Why, going back then, why do we see the development, the explosion of British power on the stage of human history when it took place? Why did the forerunner come when it did? In terms of when it did, Britain was not always great. Indeed, the rise in power of both the United States and the United Kingdom really, for the most part, began to unfold and develop after the year 1800. Herbert W. Armstrong wrote in The United States and Britain in Prophecy, "It may not be generally realized, but neither Britain nor the United States became great world powers until the 19th century. We look with an armchair quarterback hindsight in the midst of our dominance and success, and the normal everyday average assumption is that so it has always been, so it shall ever be." That was not the case, and again, nor will it always remain the case. Mr. Armstrong wrote, "Suddenly, in the very beginning of the 19th century, these two, until then small, relatively unimportant countries, suddenly spurted to national power and greatness among the nations, as no nations had ever grown and multiplied in wealth, resources, and power before. Never did any people or nation spread out or grow so suddenly and rapidly into such magnitude of national power. And nearly all this wealth came to us after 1800. Again, I'll hail back to the Charles V quote. Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th century in Europe when the Habsburg Empire in Austria and Spain dominated the European continent and international politics. And Charles aptly characterized England's relative position in the power structure among European nations by saying, once to have said, "I speak Latin to God, Italian to musicians, Spanish to ladies, French at court or in diplomatic affairs, German to servants, and English to my horses." What a criticism, and yet what an accurate depiction of where England fit into the structure of the international community in 16th century Europe. What happened in the intervening or following 200 years? Britain established an imperial supremacy, gaining control over the choicest territories of all the earth. In large part, Britain's political and military power was the upshot, the outgrowth of Britain's economic, technical, industrial development, which really began to take place between the mid to late 18th century. I want to read another quote from a well-known historian who comes out of the British Isles. His name is E.J. Hobsbawm, and if I can find the quotation, he describes the Industrial Revolution in this way. He says that it was, quote, "the most fundamental transformation of human life in the history of the world recorded in human documents." And that economic leap forward, it began in England, it took place in England in a way that it took place nowhere else on earth, and it propelled the British people ahead of all the rest of the world population. And for a space in time, England, it is not an overstatement to say, was so far ahead of all the other powers of the world that she could look back over her shoulder and virtually couldn't see who was in second place. The time when the industrial process reached critical mass, when industrialization took off, as they sometimes say in the historical literature. That's a hotly debated point among economic historians. One issue which is quite relevant, and again, which viewing history through the lens of biblical prophecy in the way that we're doing here today, it explains the question that is oftentimes asked by historians. Why was there no industrial takeoff prior to the late 18th century, when suddenly in England the transformation economically of the British Isles ultimately leads to a reworking, literally, of the economic face of the entire globe? The answer to that, why the great empires in past history, Alexander's empire, the Roman Empire, and all the empires between then and the Industrial Revolution, why did industrialization not occur? It wasn't in God's timetable. There's a story in British history which somewhat illustrates the point. It's a story about a man named Dudley. He was a 17th century innovator, and in around 1619 he began to experiment with the process of smelting iron ore using coal as the means to do that. And Dudley claimed that he was able to produce a relatively high-quality iron. He even sent samples of his product to King James I of England. Now, in due course of time, flooding, the English Civil War, which spanned 1642 to 1651, those things struck blows against Dudley's experiments and development of iron-producing technology. Moreover, Dudley sided with the Royalists in the English Civil War, and for a critical period of about a dozen years after that, after King Charles I was beheaded and Oliver Cromwell established the Protectorate, Dudley was on the outside, if you will, looking in. Cromwell's government was not interested in being receptive to the ideas of a Royalist sympathizer or supporter. In 1660, when Charles II was restored to the English throne, Charles really didn't have the cash to help Dudley in terms of continuing his experiments and ultimately unlocking the secret or the key to developing iron in a commercially manufacturable quantity or style. Iron production had to wait until Abraham Darby established the process at a little place called Coalbrookdale at a foundry that he had there. And he began to produce iron in commercially saleable quantities from coke-blasted furnaces from about 1750 onward. From that time forward, production of cast iron became possible. If you ever have the chance to travel to England, over in the southeastern part of England, very close to the border of Wales, is a museum and an industrial complex called Iron Bridge. If you've been in Greenfield Village in the United States, which is near Detroit in the city of Dearborn, it does very much the same kind of thing. It shows many of the items which led to industrialization, and in particular the production of cast iron and iron products. It's adjacent to where at Coalbrookdale Abraham Darby set up his foundry and began to produce iron in large quantities. The bottom line, in terms of the contrast between Dudley and Darby, why was Dudley unsuccessful and Darby was able to bring the process online? Well, one way to answer that question is that Darby was precisely on God's timetable and schedule. Another economic historian, one of the most highly respected conservative historians in England, a man named Charles Wilson, wrote a book called England's Apprenticeship, and there's a quote that bears repeating, relevant to the timing of industrialization. Wilson wrote, as yet, and by this he means in the year 1763, industry did not mean industrialization as a later age was to understand it. The manufacturing part of the economy, and I like this analogy, it's very appropriate, the manufacturing part of the economy was like the components of a watch, ready for assembly, but not yet interacting with one another. There were already urban industries such as brewing, soap boiling, sugar refining, and so on. But industry as a whole was far from urbanized. The greater part of the expanding export trade was sustained by rural and semi-rural industries organized on a domestic basis, or in other words, done in the home, as the textile industry was, and we'll talk about that in greater detail in Part 2. Factories there were, but few of them were mechanized on a larger scale. So as you come to the midpoint in the 18th century, by way of Wilson's analogy, it's as though on the table spread before you as a watchmaker, you had everything you needed, and all now you needed to do to make it into a precision timepiece was put those parts together, wind the watch, and off it would go, running and providing for you what the watch, or extending the analogy to industrialization, providing the economic development and change which would propel England into that stage of industrial takeoff. Some of those elements that were essential, I want to talk a little bit about that, because one of the questions that you have here, actually number 2, you'll need to know some of this information to answer that question. The iron production process became very important, even as it remains today, for heavy industrial activity. Another development has to do with the use of steam power. Initially, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine was literally the driving force, the deus ex machina, that propelled industrialization. Even there's an interesting story which somewhat is reminiscent of the Dudley Abraham Darby tale about iron production. In the late 17th century, and file this in the category of God setting the stage for accomplishing and producing what He wishes according to His timetable and His schedule. The English encountered a shortage of wood to use for fuel around the time of the late 17th century. In making up for that lack of wood to burn, they turned to an alternate fuel source. They used something that was in rich and abundant supply in England, and oftentimes relatively easy to extract. The commodity was that of coal. As Englishmen began to make greater use of coal, they found they had to dig deeper, increasingly deeper, into the mines. And as they dug into the mines, there was a problem of extracting water from a mine that went deeper and deeper. A man named Thomas Newcomen, born in 1663, he lived to 1729. In the year 1712, he invented an atmospheric pump, which was usable in pumping water out of these coal mines. That was part of the prelude to developing the use of steam power. Before we get directly to that, another element in the story is the French Wars. After the French Revolution, when revolutionary democratic France went to war against its fellow European nations and the English as well, that extended from the late and on into the early 20th century. Those wars gave greater incentive, again, for deeper mining, which once more required some means of pumping water out of the mines. In this case, not to extract coal, which, by the way, would become a principal fuel of the Industrial Revolution, but to extract metals, ores out of the earth, to be used, of course, for the war effort against the French. As an aside, question 3 in your workbook material, the war itself acted as a stimulus to the industrialization process and the growth and development of the British economy. The war operated within the broader economic boom-bust cycle, and it boosted production during those periods of warfare. And then when there were recesses in war, or in 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars finally drew to closure, when there was no need for production of, or large-scale production of wartime materials, in a rather brutal but yet very economically efficient fashion, producers that were less efficient and were able to ride the wave of wartime need suddenly found themselves out of business as wartime demand for their products collapsed. But it left behind a much highly developed industry in terms of producing iron products, in terms of metal extraction out of the earth, and put England way down the road ahead of all of its other industrial competitors. Now, moving back to the concept of steam and steam power, the man who receives credit in most textbooks for being the so-called father of the Industrial Revolution is James Watt. Watt in 1768, again as you come to the latter decades of the 18th century, he built the first working model of a steam engine. In the following year, 1769, he patented that, and by the time that the Americans were revolting in the North American colonies, by 1776, the steam engine had become a viable and a practical tool in use throughout the British Isles. Another dimension, and all of these things, as I say, we'll come back to later and explore in a more rigorous way from a historian's point of view in our discussions in Part 2. There needed to be an intellectual, philosophical support structure for the developing capitalist economy in the British Isles. That approach to economics, whether you are in favor or against it, or in favor of some aspects or against others, it proved to be the intellectual climate in which industrialization and economic growth flourished in the latter 18th century. In 1776, a Scottish professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland wrote a book. The shorter title is simply Wealth of Nations. And in that volume, Adam Smith laid out what became the gospel of laissez-faire, a doctrine of government non-intervention in economic matters. And as those ideas took root and became popular, the British gained the moral sanction that they needed to propel the rising commercial, industrial, entrepreneurial classes in Great Britain to take industrialization forward and to develop an economy which was, at least in terms of its productivity and its activity and health, was far superior at that stage in human and British history to anything else that had been seen before. Industrialization gave Britain the power to control the world. British military and naval dominance were in no small way the product of early industrialization and the power that it conferred upon this unique people whom contemporary observers looked at and said, God must be an Englishman. How else could any people be so greatly prospered and helped and blessed? Now, with that as a prelude, we'll come back next time and we'll examine the chronological framework of how the Anglo-American dominance developed approximately 2,520 years after the decimation of the northern kingdom by the ancient Assyrians. Until that time, we'll see you then.